Coast to Coast AM and CBS Radio News. Chattanooga's news, talk, and sports leader.
News Talk 1240.
Something that bears a bit of explaining because it's kind of confusing to everybody, really, not just the average Joe. But I don't think much of anyone explains or understands everything about this particular thing. UHF channels and frequencies in general are something that are things which are very complicated and hard to explain to the point where I don't get half of the stuff. Well, UHF is sort of going out of the loop, as it were. Now, the reason for that, of course, is because analog TV is not really a thing anymore. There are some municipalities where you do see analog TV, oddly enough, but for the most part, analog TV is really kind of on the out and out. Now, analog TV, of course, was on the UHF band, or some of it. Of course, there's VHF too, but the UHF band, which is in a certain range. I don't recall what megahertz band it is. I believe the numbers are in here somewhere, but it's kind of not really in use anymore, except for what they were planning to use it for, which was like military government usage, which nobody was really a fan of that idea except for the government. I was not really into that, honestly, because it seemed like a waste of good bandwidth. I mean, think about it. You have this huge spectrum now of channels which are not going to be in use by anyone except now the government, that could be used for really cool things, but weren't. Well, Gizmag has a story now about how there's a way to use dying UHF channels for what they're calling super Wi-Fi data connections. So to say that pulling data out of the air via a Wi-Fi connection is more popular in the United States than pulling down a video signal in the form of local UHF television stations probably will not come as a surprise to most Americans. But the use of the UHF spectrum is still prioritized for TV signals, oddly enough. Well, now, researchers at Houston's Rice University have demonstrated how UHF frequencies can be used for so-called super Wi-Fi without significantly interfering with legacy TV broadcasts. Now, why there are still legacy TV broadcasts, I'm not sure, actually. Digital TV seems to be much more, well, better, I guess, than analog. I don't know why we're still using analog TV in some regions. We don't really see it here. If you have an analog TV with an analog tuner and antenna and everything, and you flip through the channels, you might find one or two things, because I don't know if that's being picked up from a distance because it's really, really grainy and hard to make out what's going on. But you will pick up some very distant looking signals. But other than that, there's really not a whole lot. Now, the problem with digital TV, of course, is that it's sort of a you either have it or you don't sort of thing, because it's digital. It's ones and zeros. It's packets being encoded and decoded by your receiver. It's actually just an MPEG-2 file, essentially, that's streaming to your box. That's basically it. And it's not that complicated, actually, and it's a little bit easier on the side of the broadcaster to put that stuff out. Nevertheless, it's interesting that it's one of those things where it's just you either have it or you don't. In my area, I live on a hill, but still in my area, it's a little bit difficult to pick up some certain signals. I can pick up, say, channel 9 and 9.2 just fine, digital. I can pick up Fox's channel just fine. I can pick up CBS just fine. I could even pick up that odd Christian station, Trinity Broadcasting Network. Somehow I can pick that up too. I don't know where it comes from. And I can pick up sometimes PBS coming out of Augusta, but that's about it as far as digital TV goes. But again, you either have it or you don't. You're not going to have like a bad picture. You just don't have it anymore. It's kind of like when you're watching a YouTube video and your internet connection gets interrupted, the video just stops buffering and eventually you won't be able to watch it anymore. It's not like it'll get, snow or static in the signal and eventually it'll fade out to where you can't really make out what's happening. It doesn't work that way because it's digital. You either have it or you don't. Well, due to the popularity of cable, satellite, and internet TV, the UHF spectrum is one of the most underutilized portions of the wireless spectrum in the United States, said lead researcher Edward Knightley. That's a bitter irony because the demand for mobile data services is expected to grow tenfold in the next 5 years, and the UHF band is perfectly suited for that wireless data, which is weird because UHF is just sort of sitting there doing nothing other than broadcasting TV that nobody watches. Kind of weird, right? I mean, sure, these broadcasters can broadcast whatever they want. I'm fine with that. I'm not one of those guys who thinks that you can't broadcast certain things because it's wrong or whatever. Really, I think you can broadcast whatever you want. I don't really care. And I think that you can broadcast whatever you want so long as you own that particular space, I don't care. That's fine with me. But it does run into the argument that perhaps the common good could be brought forward by unifying these signals for a better use. Maybe. But again, that's an argument for another day, and one that I don't really care to get into because it's kind of complicated, and then you get into non-aggression and all that sort of thing. But that's something for another day. Well, UHF takes up the space between 400 and 700 megahertz on the wireless spectrum, which is high-ish, lowish. It's sort of mid-range, actually. Its signals can carry for miles and more easily penetrate walls and trees than the higher frequencies used for most wireless routers. Now, see, the thing about this is, it's kind of interesting because the higher the frequency, the more line of sight it is, which is why if you're listening to 1240, we're actually 1240 kilohertz, kilocycles. That's what it is. A hertz is a cycle. So there's so many cycles per second, and we happen to have 12,400 of them, or rather 1,240 of them, I should say. And that's why we're 1240 kilohertz or 12,000 kilocycles. Same with your frequency, say, of your processor, where you have probably a 2.4 gigahertz processor in your computer. Same idea. It's the amount of cycles that it can handle per second, or milliseconds sometimes. So that's essentially what we have here. Now, 1240 AM happens to be a very strong signal, and you can listen to it pretty much anywhere in Hamilton County if you set your mind to it. And that's because it's a low frequency. It hugs the ground. It sort of goes along the ground. And because it's a low frequency, it travels farther. And some days of the night, or rather some hours of the night, you could probably actually hear 1240 even down in Atlanta sometimes if you had a good enough tuner. I mean, it depends, but AM's kind of weird like that. Now, FM, on the other hand, not so much. The higher the frequency, the more line of sight that it is. They offset that by having extremely high frequency, or rather high power towers. That's why they have so much higher power for these towers than we need for AM to get to the certain distance that AM can get with much lower power. Well, that's how that works. So cell towers are the same way, except they're very high frequency. They're in the 2-ish gigahertz range. It depends. 2.4 is your standard wireless router, and sometimes it'll go up to 5. But 2.4 is what most wireless routers are on right now. 2.4 gigahertz is what you're going to find on a wireless router nowadays. So it's definitely not 2.4 that wireless cell phone signals are on. But anyway, UHF takes up the 400 to 700 megahertz wireless spectrum, which is prime range, actually, because, again, it'll penetrate walls, hug the ground, long distance. It's great. Its signals can carry for miles and more easily penetrate walls and trees than higher frequencies that are used for wireless routers. Despite this and the growing demand for wireless data, TV broadcasters, for some reason, continue to maintain preferential access to the UHF spectrum, even as the percentage of Americans relying on the over-the-air signals for TV programming has begun to dip into the single digits in recent years. Because who watches TV anymore anyway? And for that matter, who watches over-the-air TV, right? Most of us have a cable package. I don't even watch TV and I have a cable package, right? Most of us actually watch our news on the internet. You can do that even with our local stations. I know Channel 12 you can watch on the internet. That's our CBS radio partner, by the way. You can watch them on the internet just fine. You can watch them with your digital TV box, which is like $20 anyway. I mean, really, come on. You can get one used on eBay for like $5. So they're very inexpensive. So it's not like it's hard to get access to these sorts of things. It's really not. Well, the Federal Communications Commission, of course, is the entity which lays claim to all of this bandwidth, allows for data to be transmitted over open UHF channels not claimed by a TV broadcaster. But urban areas where the need for more Wi-Fi options is greater are also the least likely to have unclaimed UHF frequencies, oddly enough. Now, something that has to be pointed out is that we broadcast on 1240, right? I mean, we use this as an example, but we don't actually own 1240 AM. We own the rights to broadcast on 1240 AM, yeah, but we can't just say, like, we own 1240 AM. As much as I wish we could, we can't. You see, the FCC kind of technically owns 1240 AM, the frequency. The FCC lays jurisdiction or claims jurisdiction over every frequency ever. Basically, they claim to own the air, essentially. I mean, that's basically what it is. They claim to own every frequency ever because FCC says so. If you break the rules, you get fined. Now, there are arguments for that and against that. And again, we're not going to get into that. But the basic idea is that the FCC essentially lays claim to the air. It lays claim to every frequency ever that's in the United States here. And there are certain rules and regulations that carriers have to follow and radio stations have to follow. I mean, if we broke the rules, oh man, there would be massive problems. Like if I said a dirty word over the air, I would get in trouble. I would get fined. Actually, the station would get fined, but I'd probably have to pay it. If I said, a dirty word over the air, I would get fined a lot of money, actually. If, say, we played a fake EAS broadcast, oh man, can you imagine? We would get in a lot of trouble. And that's happened before to some people, of course, purely by accident, but that has happened. We would get fined a lot of money. So the FCC claims jurisdiction over this whole spectrum, this whole area. Knightley and Rice graduate student Zhu Zhang, I believe is how you say his name, designed a new solution to allow for transmitting wireless data over UHF channels during TV broadcasts over those same channels called Watch for Wi-Fi inactive TV channels, and were granted permission from the FCC to test it on the Rice campus last year. And the basic idea behind the system is to actively monitor nearby TVs that are turned to a local UHF video signal and to use advanced and efficient signal canceling technology to send wireless data over the same channel without any interference between the data and video transmission. So the basic idea is you can still watch your over-the-air TV without any interference, even though there's data signals being pushed over that same frequency. Pretty cool, right? Well, rather than adding new technology to existing UHF TV transmitters, the system instead relies on actual television sets reporting when they are being tuned to a UHF channel via smart TV remotes or possibly through integration in next-generation TVs. So when a TV tunes itself to a UHF station, the Wi-Fi system then shifts its data transmission to an unused part of the UHF spectrum. And it is kind of precise what you're tuning to, because, say, let's assume that your TV signal is, I will just say channel 12. Well, if you broadcast on channel 12.5, you probably won't notice actually any interference. So that's what the idea is, just as an example. So they say our test showed that Watch could provide at least 6 times more wireless data over existing UHF spectrum, Knightley said, adding that the system only added a fraction of a second delay to tune a test television equipped with Watch to UHF video broadcast, which was practically imperceptible to a person switching channels. Allowing the UHF spectrum to be inefficiently used makes little sense today, and we have even less sense, and will make even less sense in the future. There are already more people in the United States who will require mobile data services than there are people using broadcast-only TV. A report on the research was presented at the Association of Computing Machinery's MobiHawk 2015 conference over in China, and Rice University put out a paper discussing this. So this raises an interesting conundrum, actually. So what we have now is people who are watching TV, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who still watch TV. I don't know why, but they still do it. Probably your grandmother watches TV, maybe your mother watches TV. I know mine does, and I don't know why, but she does. Or maybe your dad likes to watch Family Feud or something, right? That's over-the-air TV. Now, it wouldn't really be fair to those people to just take away that very special joy from their lives so that we can have Wi-Fi, right? At least that's what their view might be. So, again, you run into an interesting problem. What do you do? Do we take away TV from these people in order to obtain, say, better Wi-Fi signals? Or do we somehow manage to coexist peacefully? And it seems like the coexist peacefully option is actually on the table with this new system through which you could broadcast Wi-Fi and still have over-the-air transmissions with no problem. So very cool stuff. Really excited to see how this pans out. And again, this is still in the stages of infancy. This is just a paper saying that it can be done. Think about how back in the 90s, flash memory was being toyed with, but we really didn't see flash memory coming into vogue until the mid-2000s, really. So in about 1996, compact flash cards were already possible, and in fact, were already on the market. But it wasn't really until 2005 or so that they became common. And now they're being superseded by CFast, so go figure. But think about SD cards, how SD cards were actually available in the later 90s, but they didn't really come into use until just recently, actually, especially micro SD with phones. So I think we're going to be seeing the same sort of thing with this UHF spectrum, where it's not really going to be used much now, if at all, but eventually it could very well be commonplace unless something better comes out that we don't know about yet, which is also entirely possible. Well, something that bears attention or begs attention is Jade Helm 15. A lot of people are very upset and very worried about what Jade Helm 15 is. Now, today is the day. Today is the day that Jade Helm 15 begins. Today is July the 15th. And July the 15th is, in fact, when this military drill begins. So the question now is, what is Jade Helm 15? Well, It's a program that's running for 8 weeks between July the 15th and September the 15th. And Jade Helm 15 will unite Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and other special forces for a series of unconventional warfare exercises, with military analysts speculating that it simulates operations against the Islamic State. Of course, that's in the Middle East, or even alleged Russia's involvement in eastern Ukraine. So the idea is that it could possibly be for drilling for, say, modern combat in an urban scenario, right? And in fact, according to some reports anyway, I shouldn't say in fact, but according to some allegations, there have been Walmart stores that have been shut down in order to use for impromptu medical facilities and other such facilities for this particular exercise. They say that this exercise is routine training to maintain a high level of readiness for Army Special Operations Forces, because they must be ready to support potential missions anywhere in the world on a moment's notice, explained Lieutenant Colonel Mark Lastoria, who's a U.S. Army Special Operations spokesman. Now, something that is possibly more worrying than the whole operation, which is, of course, worrying, is the fact that there are militias, we'll say, and it's not just me saying that, that's what they call themselves, militias, which are a little bit worried, we'll say, about Jade Helm 15, to the point where they're arming themselves, which of course they can do, and monitoring the situation. Half of the point of Jade Helm 15, though, according to some of these documents which I've seen, is that the agents involved are supposed to be somewhat covert, and they're supposed to be able to integrate into society without being noticed. And that's part of the tactic, is how can we go in a crowd and not be noticed as military. So it'd be interesting to see how many people can bust them, essentially, and call them out. It's like Spot the Fed at DEF CON. So it's an interesting idea. One more worrying thing about Jade Helm 15 is that there's not going to be any media allowed. Despite receiving multiple applications from leading U.S. outlets, according to RT, such as the Washington Post, to monitor the war games, the Pentagon has rebuffed all requests, saying that it would be impractical to follow commandos on fast-moving operations in real-life urban terrain, and it could also expose officers who will later perform classified missions around the world. The Army Special Operations Command has said that it may let several reporters follow a segment of an exercise if it's convenient at some point during the drills, saying we are dedicated to communicating with the public while balancing that against the application of operation security and other factors, said a statement from Lastoria. Nevertheless, Texans are not very happy. Former Marine Pete Lanteri has formed Counter Jade Helm, which is a volunteer group that will monitor the soldiers as they operate in Texas, with similar organizations springing up in other states as well, which are involved in the war games. If a team member sees two Humvees full of soldiers driving through town, they're going to follow them, said Eric Johnston, one of the organizers. That's what he told the Houston Chronicle earlier this month, saying, and they're going to radio back their ultimate location, saying, we're going to be watching what they do in the public, said Lanteri. Obviously, on a military base, they can do whatever they want, but if they're going to train on public land, we have a right as American citizens to watch what they're doing. So the governor of Texas, Rick Perry, of course, is also, or rather, Governor Greg Abbott now. Rick Perry is no longer governor, pardon me. Greg Abbott is a little bit upset about this as well, and he's charged the Texas State Guard, which is a traditional militia that numbers 1,900 and cannot be recruited into the federal army at times of war, with observing the actions of the Special Forces units. So lots of people are worried about Jade Helm, to say the least. Texas, of course, being first and foremost in the movement against Jade Helm. This is going to lead to, or potentially could lead to, because there are no definites, could potentially lead to something dangerous, we'll say. Some say that it's drilling for a military operation, the likes of which has never been seen before, such as, say, martial law or what have you. Some are worried that it's training exercises for martial law. I don't know if that's the case. And it very well could be, but I don't know if it is. And I can't just tell you straight up that it is, because I don't know. Nobody does for sure, except for the people who are in command, of course, and they're not going to give any interviews, I can tell you that much. So what's going to happen? Well, hopefully what doesn't happen is somebody in one of these militias gets scared, spooked, gets trigger happy, and fires on a service member and causes a firefight, and all sorts of chaos breaks out, and that would be bad. Now, I don't think that'll happen, but there is potentiality, and it's worrying, to say the least. What also could happen is nothing at all, and we don't even notice that anything happened, which is less likely. Something we can rely on, of course, is citizen journalism, which I'm very excited to see what will happen with that. Citizen journalism, of course, is a regular guy with a camera phone filming what goes on. and possibly even giving his commentary and eyewitness accounts. Twitter is actually becoming one of the better news sources. No, seriously, Twitter and Facebook are now what a lot of people rely on to gather their news. Very interesting. We're going to be talking about that in just a few seconds right here on Hot News Talk Radio, AM 1240, and Digital Drive. And Hot News Talk Radio is everywhere. Listen live to Hot News Talk Radio at hotnewstalkradio.com. Download the TuneIn Radio app and search for Hot News Talk Radio. Hot News Talk Radio is also on Twitter, where you report the world decides. That's AM 1240, Hot News Talk Radio. You can save half off now. Go to hotnewstalkradio.com and click on the half off link. That's hotnewstalkradio.com.
This is a mob mode. This is the mob mode. What kind of fool do you think I am? You think I know nothing of
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
Hi, this is your computer speaking. I don't feel so well. It's like I've come down with a bug, and I'm getting slower.
Affordable Computers. We fix sick computers. Your hometown guys at Affordable Computers will repair your PC in half the time of the big boys at an affordable price. No tricks, no gimmicks, no computer speak technobabble. Just good, quick, and courteous affordable service and repairs. Want to affordably supercharge your PC? Affordable Computers on Highway 58. Affordable Computers hand builds all desktops in-house. If you're looking for a better-than-new refurb laptop, $150 will get you a Dell or another name brand at Affordable Computers. Affordable Computers, Highway 58, between Arby's and Taco Bell. Also Fort O, Battlefield Parkway, near Holcomb's. Affordable Computers, we service what we sell. Call 499-1975. That's 499-1975.
Wow, this is amazing. I'm feeling great. Supercharged.
We've got a table here at Delia's in Saudi Daisy, ready to delight in a plate of authentic Mexican food. Delia's spreads a rich selection: loaded nachos, crazy chicken, homemade tamales, maybe the enchiladas with beef, chicken, pork, quesadillas. Every dish beautifully pictured on the menu to help us decide. Join us for lunch or dinner. We're at Delia's in Saudi Daisy on Dayton Pike near the Thrasher Light. Here's dinner. Delia's uses the freshest ingredients, cooked to perfection. Nachos, homemade. Delia's open every day except the Lord's Day. For lunch and dinner, treat yourself to Delia's genuine Mexican food. In Saudi, call 521-7145. That's 521-7145.
Do you feel better outside your home or business than in? Indoor air quality is important. Mildew, mold, smoke, water, and rodent damage are prime causes of poor indoor air quality. Ducts Indoor Air Professionals, better known as Duct Busters, cleans HVAC systems using 127 definable Duct Busters steps. Let Mark Thompson address the indoor air quality at your business to help reduce employee illnesses. Prevent fires by cleaning your dryer vents. Mark and his parents, Dick and Joan Thompson, have been building our local economy and helping local people with HVAC systems 16 years. Ducts Indoor Air Professionals. Call 876-9907. 876-9907. Ducts. Call now.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
You love your hometown. Are you interested in free markets, in local economy? Do you hope that Chattanooga can survive the next meltdown, the next chain of disasters in the national economy? What's the best way to live out the ideals of self-government and self-determination? Join me, David Toulis, weekdays 1 to 3.
Hot News Talk 1240.
Love your neighbor, buy local.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
Hot News Talk 1240.
Fox News Radio. I'm Lillian Wu. The president and vice president talking of the Iran nuclear deal, which is facing some skepticism from lawmakers, some critical of a provision about nuclear site inspections.
Where the coalition has to actually notify the Iranians before conducting an inspection. And so the concern is that they'll be able to outflank inspectors with that delay.
Fox's Kevin Cork. 3 years after the Colorado theater shooting, the jury gets the case.
James Holmes is pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense attorney told jurors Holmes was and is mentally ill and that they should accept his sickness. Outside court, Sandy Phillips, whose daughter Jessica Gowie was killed, said if she could say something to the jury, it's
he wanted to kill people. He managed to do it, and he should be held accountable.
In his closing arguments, the district attorney told jurors not to buy the insanity defense.
Fox Radio's Jessica Rosenthal and Fed Chief Janet Yellen expecting an interest rate hike this year. Fox News, we report, you decide.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
Fox News Talk 1240.
Well, Jade Helm 15 is causing quite a few people to be upset, to say the least, and it's supposed to be beginning, well, today. Now, this points out something that, or raises attention to something, I should say, that's perhaps overlooked by the media because it's threatening to the media. Now, that thing is, of course, citizen journalism. Now, the journalists that we have today, at least in the mainstream, or whatever you might describe as mainstream, however you may define that, are rather threatened by citizen journalism because these are people who are not trained in any formal sort of way, who are able to take very good video and report on things in a very factual way without being trained in any sort of way. Now, it's threatening to these people who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars or less or more on a college education that is being threatened by these people. And that's kind of the problem that they foresee or see coming already. So what we have now is journalists like, you know, your old school journalists. You've got, well, those guys who have been around for a long time, say Peter Jennings types, may he rest in peace, of course. People such as him who have been around for years and years and years, and or Charlie Rose, just as a better example, who've been around forever, and or George Stephanopoulos, again, been around forever, who are now sort of being really threatened by, not in any sort of malicious way on their part, but still it is happening, by these journalists who are able to get much better footage and much better stories just by merit of owning a camera and being at the right place at the right time. And it's threatening to these journalists because they've nothing to do, really, if that happens, other than just report on what somebody else has already found. Investigative journalism has been brought to a new front in a way that was unprecedented before. I mean, who could have predicted that this would happen 20 years ago? Not really much of anyone. But now we have this brand new idea of this just it's an amazing phenomenon, really, where we can get amazing video that would be totally unavailable from the regular media because they wouldn't want to film it because it might threaten status quo or some government official asked them not to or what have you, you know? Imagine if everyone had a video camera like they do now during the days of, say, Desert Storm, where there was that media blackout that's extremely questionable. What if there are people on the ground in Iraq who had video cameras who were able to film everything from their own perspective? I wonder if that would have changed our point of view on the war. Think about what we have now with the war going on in Syria, where there are people who have video cameras who can film what's going on, and it's fascinating to watch. It's very interesting because it gives you a point of view that you would not ever have previous to this, you know, because this footage is never going to be aired on TV because it's too violent, it's too shocking, perhaps it's just too out there for them to show on TV. And TV is, again, going the way of the dinosaur thanks to this, because you're not going to see this sort of stuff on TV a lot of the time. I mean, if you've watched on Live Leak, just as an example, some of the footage that we see coming out of Syria or what was going on in Libya at the time in 2011, what was going on in Egypt, of course, during the revolution there, it's really shocking, fascinating things. We're doing the Gaza war, which is atrocious. All the different things that happened then. You got a point of view that could not have been had even 15 years ago. So that's what's going to be perhaps the stroke that kills the secrecy of Jade Helm if everyone can have a video camera and film what goes on. And it's really going to possibly threaten operations, which some people will say is negative, some people will say is positive. I, as a journalist, remain neutral, of course. But I think that it will be interesting, to say the least, to see what happens with Jade Helm 15 and the citizen journalists who are able to film these things in a way that really, again, was not possible even 20 years ago. Well, Facebook and Twitter, just to further exemplify this, are becoming much better sources of news, and in fact are most people's sources of news nowadays. Facebook and Twitter are growing as news sources, according to Pew. So the Pew Research Center, according to The Verge, has announced today that it made a new discovery. Facebook and Twitter are growing in influence, with more and more users using them, of course, as a source of news. So we kind of had a sense that this was happening as both sites were making moves to establish themselves as news destinations. And the Pew study seems to suggest that their efforts might actually be paying off, especially with Twitter, where if you remember the Baltimore riots, unless you were born yesterday, literally, you pretty much have to. But the Baltimore riots that were happening, live tweets were essential to figuring out what was happening. Hurricane Sandy, if you remember when that happened, live tweets were essential to figure out what was happening on the ground, because there were cameramen who just didn't want to be there. Can you blame them? But live tweets from people who were actually there, and photos and such, were really showing the truly nasty effects of what was going on at that particular time, especially in Baltimore as well. Well, this increase isn't due to a growing user base for those sites, because they've pretty much topped out, actually, but rather that existing users are increasingly discovering news stories there. Pew found that 63% of users on both Facebook and Twitter said that they use the sites to find out about news and current events. These findings are probably particularly heartening for both sites, both of which have been pushing for greater focus on news lately. Twitter's Project Lightning will focus on providing live coverage and breaking news to everyone, whether they have Twitter accounts or not. And Facebook has launched instant articles in May, allowing news organizations to publish directly on the site. The study may also serve as a wake-up call to more traditional media organizations, which are going the way of the dinosaur very quickly, emphasizing the importance of incorporating social media into their daily duties, because Pew's study wasn't limited to talking about millennials. The share of media consumers getting their news from social media extended across all demographics, with both male and female users increasingly using Facebook, and Twitter getting more notice from users both under and over 35. However, most users still describe both sites as secondary sources, and it is still younger users who place greater influence on social media sites for their news. The question still remains as to what extent users are actually reading the news stories, because most people seem to get their news only from the headlines, which is unfortunate. Take the Iran nuclear deal as an example. People didn't actually read the treaty because they can't be bothered to. They just assume that it's a terrible negative thing, and it can only be that, when in actuality they haven't actually read the studies to supposedly prove that, and they don't know, other than just saying, well, this headline says that this means death for the Middle East, so I'm against it. And that's really as far as most people went, which is unfortunate, because maybe there's a failure on the side of news reporters. I can attest to that. And maybe it's a failure on everyone else's part as well, for simply not paying attention and not doing research for themselves. I don't know, but still, it's a little bit obnoxious that people only get their news from headlines. It's kind of annoying, but that's just how it is, I suppose. That's just the name of the game when we're talking about news gathering. It's just going to be that way, I suppose, that people are only going to get their news from these headlines, and that's about it. I mean, look at what was happening with the Confederate flag, where people actually think that the Confederate flag is being banned, when really it's not. I mean, it couldn't possibly be, at least not now. Maybe sometime in the future, 20, 15 years from now, but not now. That would be a massive leap in terms of the First Amendment to actually go ahead and ban the Confederate flag, right? I mean, ridiculous. It's highly unlikely that this would ever happen. It's more a example of, say, a industry choosing to do whatever it will. Say Walmart decides to not sell Confederate flags anymore. Hey, guess what? They can do that. Walmart can do that. That's its decision to make. And really, if they want to make that decision, it's my choice to shop there or not. I don't really care personally, but it's my decision to shop there or not. And that's about as far as it goes, really. There's not really any effort to ban much of anything these days, funnily enough. People like to throw around words as a means to make the story seem more shocking or more outrageous, when in actuality it's not. It's kind of a non-issue, but people like to do that, where they like to throw out rhetoric to make stories seem more intense or more of a big deal than they actually really are. Kind of like the whole Confederate flag deal, where I didn't necessarily see that as a whole big deal. A lot of people did, and I sort of beg to differ, I suppose. I contend with that. I would contest that point of view. But anyway, Uber has settled a lawsuit with a family who had a 6-year-old child allegedly killed by a driver. Family of a 6-year-old girl who was killed in a car accident has reached a tentative settlement with Uber, likely ending the wrongful death lawsuit brought in January of 2014. Court documents showed that the girl's parents asked the court on Monday to keep the settlement amount sealed. The child, Sophia Liu, was killed on December the 31st, 2013, when Syed Muzaffar was using the Uber app while he was driving. However, he did not have anyone in his car at the time of the accident. Muzaffar, who was also sued and is party to the settlement, was also charged criminally with vehicular manslaughter. Uber has previously argued that because Muzaffar was not providing services on the Uber system during the time of the accident, the company is not responsible. Andrew Noyes, a Uber spokesperson, declined further comment when the suit was originally filed. In March of 2014, both Uber and Lyft expanded their insurance policy to cover drivers in Muzaffar's situation. The Lius suffered a terrible tragedy, and our hearts go out to them, said Trina Smith, who's an Uber spokeswoman, to ours on Tuesday, saying, while we cannot ease their pain, we do hope that this settlement helps the family to move forward. Smith declined to disclose the amount that the company and Muzaffar will pay to the Liu family. Uber's own terms of service attempts to absolve the company of all responsibility. Still, though, it is, of course, a tragedy which occurred, and liability is certainly an issue when you have a company such as Uber. There are some problems, though, and let's attempt to cover them. Okay, so the driver of this car was, of course, according to these reports anyway, using the Uber app while driving. Now, if that is indeed true, and that's what the police report says, that's a problem in and of itself. The fact that he was, or the allegation that he was using the Uber app is really kind of not really an issue. The issue is the alleged use of an app while operating a motor vehicle. Usage of a cell phone while operating a motor vehicle is, of course, not legal and thus can lead to problems, which is what happened here with this Uber driver who crashed and unfortunately caused the death of a young child. If that is indeed the case, of course, allegations. Still, though, he's being charged with vehicular manslaughter, and that seems to be quite appropriate considering the allegations, but I don't think the Uber app is really involved in this in any sort of way. Sure, the driver was allegedly using the Uber app, but that's kind of immaterial. He could have been playing Angry Birds and it would have had the same effect, right? I'm not sure if him using the Uber app really means much of anything other than just he was using the Uber app. You see what I mean? It seems to be kind of out of the picture that the app was the Uber app. It seems more the problem was that the person was using the cell phone whilst driving, according to the allegations. That's really the problem, not what app the person was using. But again, that's my point of view. That's just me. But it seems kind of immaterial, and I would have certainly brought up that argument if it was brought to a lawsuit. Of course, Uber settled with the family, and that's not to take away from the loss. Absolutely not. This is a terrible, awful thing which happened. This poor family losing a child like that is, I can't even imagine. So definitely thoughts go out to them, and certainly be praying that they find some comfort in this time of loss, because it really is an awful thing to lose a child like that. Of course, I don't need to tell you that. The ACLU says to an appellate court, please halt the NSA's resumed bulk data collection. That's unlikely, but it's a valiant effort, of course, on the side of the ACLU. The American Civil Liberties Union has asked one of the nation's top appellate courts to order the National Security Agency to stop its bulk records collection, which resumed in limited form last month as part of the USA Freedom Act, which is kind of the opposite of that, actually, because it doesn't offer us any more freedom at all. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals had previously ruled in ACLU v. Clapper in May 2015 that the Dragnet data collection went beyond the scope of what was authorized by Congress. The Dragnet surveillance program should never have been launched and should certainly be terminated now, said Jamil Jaffer, a deputy legal director at the ACLU. That's what he said in a statement on Tuesday, saying not even the government contends anymore that the program has been effective, and the Second Circuit has already concluded that the program is illegal. It's a needless and unlawful intrusion into the privacy rights of millions of innocent Americans. The previous collection program was stopped temporarily when Section 215 of the Patriot Act expired, but with the passage of the USA Freedom Act on June the 2nd, 2015, the government can now access the phone records from telecom companies with an individualized court record from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Record, or Surveillance Court, I should say. The FISC allowed the government to continue its existing bulk collection as it transitions to compliance with the USA Freedom Act. The ACLU argued at its filing, saying the legislative debate to which this court deferred has now come and gone. Although it considered doing so, Congress did not expand the government's statutory authority to permit bulk collection of call records. The government continues to collect call records in bulk, however, based on the same statutory language that the court has already held, does not permit it. The government apparently intends to continue the surveillance for at least 180 days, as it apparently intends to retain and use the fruits of its unlawful surveillance indefinitely. Against this background, plaintiffs respectfully urge the court to issue the preliminary injunctive relief that it refrained from issuing earlier. Now, this is, of course, a bit of a conundrum, to say the least, for the NSA. Now, anything that causes problems for the NSA makes me very happy. So what's happening here is the NSA is being accused of continuing data collection programs despite them having been found to be unlawful by an appeals court. And that is indeed true. An appeals court did find that the NSA bulk data collection was in fact illegal. So what do you want to do? After that point, what do you do? Well, of course, you can do what the ACLU is doing and file a lawsuit, but really, what good is it going to do? Think about it. What's the enforcement agency that would stop the NSA from issuing these bulk data collection records or demanding that they be given to them? Really, I mean, who's going to stop them? Are you? Well, I mean, you could try, but you'd certainly die in the process, I'm sure. So who's going to stop the NSA from this bulk data collection? Now, you might live in fantasy land and say that the military shall rise up and stop the NSA from using this bulk data collection. That's highly unlikely. After all, people in the military probably don't really care that much about it, and also probably don't want to risk dying for any sort of moral cause such as that one, and probably also don't want to defy direct orders. That's kind of a problem. If you're in the military, I'm sure you know about that. So it's leading to a bit of a conundrum. Who's actually going to stop the NSA from leading this bulk data collection record, or rather from using bulk data collection in its records? Well, technically we can actually. Not through any legal means, of course, but we can stop them from doing this. How, you might be asking? Well, better encryption. I mean, that's one option anyway, double-blind communications, all that sort of thing. Now, these things can be stopped, unfortunately, by the NSA, given that it has rather large and rather effective supercomputers, which are quite good at cracking encryption. Still, though, it does make their job harder for them, and that makes me happy. Still, though, who's going to stop the NSA from collecting this information? I mean, seriously, who's going to? The FBI is certainly not going to raid the offices of the NSA and order them to cease their bulk data collection. It's probably not going to happen. I'm sure that the CIA is very happy that the NSA is collecting bulk data collection records. So really, who's going to stop the NSA? That's a question that can't really be answered. Sure, possibly Congress could pass some sort of legislation that would stop the NSA from doing what it does, but that was called the USA Freedom Act, and it didn't actually do much of anything, but we were supposed to think that it would. So obviously, bulk data collection is pretty much just going to continue, and there's not really a whole lot that we can do about it. Now, that's kind of okay. Now, not in principle, it's not okay, definitely not by principle, but there are reasons why it doesn't particularly matter that much right now. Reason being, it's not sustainable. Essentially, what's going to stop the NSA is the NSA itself. The NSA is an insustainable entity that really couldn't possibly continue to exist for very much longer. No, that sort of sounds like one of those doomsday prophecies, right? Where you say the world's going to end in 2012. Trust me, trust me. It's sort of the same sort of thing where you say the NSA is going to stop its bulk data collection. Trust me, trust me. Well, it kind of has to, actually, just going by the rules that we've seen being implemented previously, the rules of nature, perhaps, with end of government, where this sort of thing kind of has to stop because it's unsustainable. It's a tyrannical system that I can't imagine would continue to exist for very much longer, be it from a collapse on their side or from a initiated collapse from some sort of outside influence. Either way, it really can't continue to exist for very much longer. People are continually losing faith in the government, and that's okay and good, actually. If people lose faith in the government, then people will realize that, hey, I don't actually want their services. Think about it. If I suddenly lose faith in the government and I say, hey, I'm not going to call 911 when I have an emergency, because why would I? that makes no sense to me because I don't really expect them to actually protect me in any sort of way. So when people start to realize that the government actually is not doing them much of any good and is actually causing more harm than good, then you might say shares will be sold off in bulk and no one will want to buy them because no one will want to have any sort of stock in a governmental system such as this one. That being the case, then people are really going to be fortunately losing faith in the government, which would cause at least sort of a mini collapse in and of itself, which would then cause sort of a chain effect, a chain reaction, which would cause more and more collapse. I mean, even the different companies such as Apple and Google have lost faith in the government already, implementing encryption by default. WhatsApp, the chat application for your phone, uses encryption by default. So it's making it harder and harder for the government to do its job, which is actually good. Which is funny because if you said that in the 80s, people would stone you to death for daring to defy the words of St. Reagan. Nevertheless, he was kind of wrong in a lot of ways. But if you ever dare question the government, to a lot of people, you're just the worst ever, and you probably like communism too. And of course, that's not true. I think communism is a failed concept, and so is crony capitalism. And that's kind of the problem that we have now. So is a mass surveillance state. It's a failed concept. It was tried, and the evidence shows now that it doesn't really work. So it should be kind of left to go the way of the dinosaur, much like many other failed concepts, such as trickle-down economics. So it's kind of a failure. That's just how it is. The surveillance state is kind of a failure. And there's not much that we can do to initiate collapse other than just say, hey, I don't really care for your services anymore, and I have no faith in the NSA because I'm given no reason to. I have no faith in the CIA because it's a terrorist organization. I have no faith in the FBI because it doesn't actually do its job. I have no faith in police departments because they actually break the law more than they enforce the law. All sorts of these sorts of arguments are what will inevitably lead to a total and definite, fortunately, collapse of the system, which is, again, not bad. See, that's where people have this misconception, is people say, well, collapse of government means no rule of law, which means anarchy. And anarchy equals bad. My school teacher taught me that. I mean, look at the Spanish Civil War. Anarchy equals bad, and so that means chaos. Well, that actually isn't necessarily true. Think about it this way. If there were no police around, would you commit a crime? Probably not. If there was no one around to ever enforce the law, would you actually commit a crime? You probably wouldn't. Same as I'm not a violent person, and so given a room full of people who I strongly dislike and given a weapon, would I shoot them? Well, no, I wouldn't. Of course not. That would be wrong. And most people probably wouldn't. So that's the situation which we would be facing. It would be a situation where really nothing much would change other than perhaps a financial crisis in the short term, and in the long term, people using the local economy systems in a way that's much more better, we'll say, for us in the long term. If we suddenly start to use local economy systems instead of relying on national economy, we'll be much better off anyway. And that's something that perhaps the government doesn't want you to know. Could it be? Is there something that they don't want you to know? Well, certainly. And it's not things like 9/11 was an inside job or anything like that. That's really that's peanuts to them. What really is the big secret is that we don't need them. That's kind of the big shocking thing, is that we actually don't need them. And that revelation is what causes collapses. And that's what causes instability. Not realizing that the Gulf of Tonkin was a farce. Not realizing that the Pentagon was hit by a missile or anything like that. No, it's just, hey, I don't really need you, actually, because I can go about my day-to-day business without the help of the FBI and the NSA. It's shocking, really, but that's true, actually. I could go about my day-to-day business without the help of any sort of governmental system. Smaller is pretty much always better when it comes to governmental systems. This is Digital Drive. I'm your host, Russell. We're talking about technology and quite a bit more. And this is Hot News Talk Radio, AM 1240, and hotnewstalkradio.com. Nukenomics.com is up next.
This is a mob mode. This is the mob mode. What kind of fool do you think I am?
Arnie Guest Goldsmith, Chattanooga.